Hi, second grade. This is your friendly neighborhood art teacher. Now, some of you I gave a hint to about our next art project. That hint was it has something to do with something messy, something to do with dirt, and it has to do with an animal called a monopod. And if you weren't somebody who heard that clue before, if you put those two parts of the word together, if you look at the first part, mono, M-O-N-O, mono actually means one. So if you have a mono stereo, that means you have one speaker. So if you are talking about a monopod, which is all one word, but I put a space so you can see the different parts. If you have a monopod, if mono means one, and in science pod actually means foot, then that tells you that this animal is an animal that has 1 foot. So it's actually an animal that has 1 foot. I had a couple of people who guessed Bigfoot, a couple of people who guessed a worm. Well, not quite. This monopod has 1 big foot on the bottom, and ours will have a shell on the back. It's a snail. So if you look at a snail from the side, you'll have basically a head. Usually you'll see some eye stalks where they can sense light. You'll have a shell on the back. And this counts as their foot. So they have 1 great big foot that goes almost the whole length of their body. That's part of the reason they're called a monopod. So what you guys are going to do is you guys are going to have a clay project coming. Yay! That's where the dirt comes in. So I know we've talked about this maybe a couple of years ago, but in case you weren't here, in case you don't remember, clay is actually a special kind of mud. So in the mountains, when you have mountains, and there are rocks, and there's dirt and soil, you'll have something called silt. So eventually what happens is rainstorms happen all the time. Water comes into those mountains, and that water, at some point or another, starts to wash that dirt away. So it might create a stream if there was enough water, or there might be a stream already. But what happens is those little pieces of dirt get swept downstream. The smallest ones, which are smaller than a grain of sand, are actually called silt. S-I-L-T. So silt is just tiny, tiny, tiny little pieces of dirt. So that dirt goes down those rivers, and those rivers are flowing pretty good. Even if they're slow, that water's moving pretty fast. Eventually that water wants to go to the lowest area, which usually turns into a lake because of all the water that just kind of sits there. So that silt comes down those rivers and it starts to hit the lake. And once it hits the lake and stops moving, those heavier pieces of dirt and the silt sinks to the bottom because it's heavier than water. And over time it creates this great big thick layer of mud that's sticky and slippery, and we call it clay. So clay actually forms in the bottom of lakes. And then eventually that lake either evaporates or something happens to it. Most of the time it's dried out, or something has come along and the dam broke, or something happens where the water drains, or it just goes away. The water of the river changes direction, goes somewhere else. But eventually that kind of goes away. Sometimes there will be a layer of soil above it with grass growing on it. But eventually somebody discovers that there's this layer, or this old lake bed on the bottom. And they want that clay. Clay is a very useful thing. So they will dig that soil out, and they actually will take that clay out, and they take it to a factory or a refinery, or you can do this at home if you know what you're doing. I don't, so I don't do this. But those places, those people, will take that out, and they'll take it somewhere to have the rocks and the sticks and anything that's not clay taken out of it. So it's clean stuff by the time they're done. They package it back up, and then we buy it to use. Now the special thing about clay, and why it's a special kind of mud, is if it gets really heated up, I'm talking about 2,000 degrees, which is about 4 times as much as the oven at home, it will actually turn to stone. So what we're going to be using is actually this stuff. Let me grab it out of the bag here so you can hear me rustle around. And this clay, this special kind of mud, actually sat at the bottom of a lake at one point in its life. So this is all of kinds of different pieces of dirt, little tiny pieces of silt all put together. You won't be able to see them with your eyes because they're so small, they're smaller than sand. So it's actually a really, really cool way to use this. Now your job is going to be to make a snail. Now this involves a process called coil building. So if you've ever seen it, and you'll probably get either a fork, or these aren't really, they're not very sharp. It's kind of like a butter knife. It looks like a really, really wicked looking knife, but this is a clay knife, so it's meant to bend a little bit. Don't bend it on purpose if I get these to you, but chances are you'll probably have one of these. Because a fork, since clay is so soft, that works just as good. So you're going to take a good chunk of your clay, and you're going to start by making what most kids would call a snake. In clay building, we call it a coil. So you might have to squish it a little bit, get it in the right direction, get it started. But you're going to take this piece of clay and you're going to roll it. So start in the middle, and what I'm doing is I have my hands kind of tilted in a little bit so that when I'm rolling it, it's actually coming from here and it's pushing its way out. If you start like this with your hands flat, or you start like this, it's going to push the clay in. So I'm going to tilt my hands just a little bit, and I'm mostly going to be pressing with these fingers. These fingers are kind of to guide it, but I'm going to kind of do this kind of motion. That's going to move everything out to the side. Now I have to be careful because a couple of things will happen. Either you'll do this and it's going to get oval shaped, which means you got to put it on its side and mush it back a bit, or it could get a bump, or sometimes, and this one's a really big piece, so I'm going to go ahead and cut that a little bit. Sometimes what ends up happening is you get too thin, so I'm going to roll this for a little bit. You might see me pause because I'll get those little oval oblong things too. So I want this to be round. So I'm going to mush it. And I'm going to take my time and I'm going to move from the center out. Center out. And this one I'm going to make a little thicker. This is going to be the bottom of my snail. So I can be a little bit thicker with this coil. So I want it to be nice and smooth. You can see it's getting longer every time I move from the center out. I'm trying to make it as uniform as I can, so this should be almost as thick as this. You can see it's a little bit off, but not by much. So since this end's thicker, I'm going to go over here and make it a little thinner. Just go from here out. And then this is going to be my snail. So I'm going to start with, I think I like this part as the head, so I'm going to give it a nice little trim. Get some of that little stuff off. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bend it backwards. Whoops, now you can see that little bit it happened there. It's a little bit drier than yours will be because I've been playing with it to get the camera working. So I'm just going to bend this back on itself a little bit, a little at a time since it's a little drier. And I'm going to bend this forward. And that will be the head of my snail. Now eventually you're going to get a dowel rod, which is a stick. I'm going to use a pencil because that's what I have at my desk. But this stuff shouldn't happen too much on yours because your clay will be a little bit wetter than mine is. But since it's cracking, I'm just going to take my finger and smooth those out, make it look nice. And then if I want to, I can put a little tail at the end. I'll wait till the last bit. But right here, you're going to have a dowel rod or a stick of some kind, probably a chopstick actually, because the chopsticks work a lot better. I'm just going to take an old pencil I don't care about. And you're going to stick it through the head of your snail. So if this completely closes, that's okay. You're going to take some kind of a thing and poke it through. So the goal is to have an opening that's big enough for a pipe cleaner to go through once it's dry. That doesn't mean that if it's only big enough for a pipe cleaner it'll work though, because this clay will actually shrink a little bit. So that big hole won't be that nearly as big when we're all done. So I got to make sure it's big enough that if it shrinks a little bit, it's going to be good to go. So once I get this done, I'm going to put that off to the side. I'm going to grab this one. I'm going to do another coil. Now you are also going to get, in addition to the fork, you're going to get a little tiny dish of water, and I'm going to teach you a little bit about that. So hang on a second. You are not going to do clay this class. I know that's a little bit of a bummer, but this is going to take you all class. This is going to take a 40-minute class completely. So I want to be able to let you guys grab your clay, get your stuff, and go the next time you come in, which means that you have to be ready to roll as soon as you hit the door, which means we got to give you the directions today so that you can get working right away next time. I know it's a bit of a bummer not to get to do this on the same day that I do that, but trust me, it's going to pay off. Now I'm getting a little thin with this. You can still see it's about as thick as my thumb, which is good. My thumbs are pretty big, so that's a good place. It's a little bit oval, so I'm going to press down a little bit on the tall side. And then I've got to attach and make a shell. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try and coil this. Now, the problem is, if you take 2 pieces of clay, I'm just going to rip these apart and show you, and you try and stick them together, they're actually not going to work, because most kids think what they can do is they can take these and they can push them together really hard and they're going to stick. Well, here's the thing. Clay has water in it. That's why it's wet. So when that water evaporates and gets out of the clay and into the air, all that's left is the dirt, which means that since the water is gone, this shrinks. So it will actually be a smaller size when it's dried, which means that this part and this part will pull away from each other. And if there's no way to grab onto each other, what happens is exactly this. You saw how hard I push. I'm pushing. I'm really, like, my hands are shaking that it's so hard. And I can just snap it apart. You don't want these things to fall apart. So what we have to do is we have to get something that's going to lock together like a puzzle. So what we're going to do is, that's where your water and your fork come in. So there is just enough water in that the bottom is wet. Almost the whole thing is empty except the very bottom, which is just enough to make the bottom wet. If you put too much on your table, it's going to slop all over. This is more than enough, trust me. If you all need more, the sinks are in the back of the room. You can always go get more. So in order to attach a piece of clay, you're going to do something called score and slip. To score, it's not like, yay, football, we scored a point, goal, not that kind of thing. A score can also mean to scratch. So you're going to scratch it and then do something else to it. So scratching, you don't want to go through the whole thing. You don't want to take this and cut through the whole thing. That doesn't help. What you just want to do is rough up the surface. You just want to get it a little bit rough. This, that's too light. You want to get it nice and rough. So just drag your fork through that. Once you get that one done, the other piece gets done. Now, I'm doing it on the big piece so you can see what I'm doing, because I'm going to speed up when I go to do my coil. So I'm roughing it up. So that's the score. And the slip is actually a clay term. Slip means clay with a lot of water in it. And it kind of acts like glue. If you put actual glue on this clay, A, it won't stick, and B, it will burn up in the kiln and it won't be there anyway. So it doesn't do you any good. Now, I've had kids that say, is it wrong to put the fork in there and do that? Yeah, you can, but it doesn't always get a lot of water on there, so I prefer to dip my 2 fingers in there and put that on there. You don't have to get it really sloppy, just wet. So what happens is you scored it, which means you've made some rough spots, and you've made them soft so that when you push it together, they're going to lock tight, especially once they start to dry out a little bit. That's really going to be a strong bond. So what you're going to want to do is take this, and when you have 2 pieces like that, and you go to push them together, while it's still fresh and it's still wet, you might be able to pull them apart. But when you actually put those together and they dry just a little bit for a few seconds, chances of you pulling it apart, in that particular spot, you can see it's not coming. It's glued tight. It's not going to come out again. So when you are attaching 2 pieces of clay that are separate from each other, everything that touches another piece of clay has to be scored and slipped. So for your shell, what that means is you're going to have to walk through it, because you can't do it all at once. So I would take a little bit of this, rough it up, be careful not to cut through the whole thing. You're going to dab that on. Be careful not to do this, because when you do that and you smooth it, you're getting rid of your score lines. You're actually closing them. So don't do that. You just want to put enough on there that it gets wet. That's basically what you're doing. It doesn't have to be sloppy, just enough to get that glue in there. And then you're going to start to roll this up. Now you can see it's going to start touching here, so I actually have to do it on both sides of the roll, which is where it comes into a little bit of time. But the bigger it gets, the easier and the longer you can roll it before you have to do that. So I'm going to keep going. Okay, now I didn't do this part, so I got to go this way. Scoring, trying not to cut through the whole thing, just roughing it up. And rolling it. Scoring it. Now, are these going to be messy? Yes. You can polish it after you're done. Now you can see I'm coming to the end of my score down here, so I got to pay attention to that. Move a little bit ahead of where I'm going. Whoops. Your tables are going to get a little messy. That's okay. Squishing it down in, making sure it's nice and tight against the roll. Getting to a point now where it's, again, not quite scored or slipped on that end, so I'm going to keep going. You can see it's going to take a little bit more every time because you're going further every time. I'm probably not going to use this whole thing because it's going to get pretty big. I didn't measure out my clay before I did it. I just grabbed a chunk. Alright, so that'll be probably about where I want to end it. So I'm going to cut it right there. And if you want to, and you're worried about it, you can take these, mush them together, and then take your finger and just smooth it out. I tend to like this curly part. That's up to you. You don't have to have that curly part. If you want to smooth it out, you can. I'm just taking my finger and cleaning it up a little bit. However it goes in the kiln is how it's going to come out of the kiln. So if it goes in looking rough, it's going to come out looking rough. If it goes in smooth, chances are it's going to come out looking smooth, or at least as smooth as it can. So this part has to attach to this part. Same thing I said before. You got to score and slip wherever it's going to touch. So I'm planning to have the neck touch to make it nice and tough. I want to have as many places touch as I can so it's not going to break. And then let's see, okay, right there. So I'm going to lift my snail up so he's sitting upright. Make sure he's sitting flat. I don't want him to tip. So if he's tippy before he dries, he's definitely going to be tippy after he dries. So a little bit roughen up, a little bit more. Yes, my fingers are dirty. We'll take care of that at the sink in a minute. Smush that on. If you need me to help you with this part, I can. If you're not sure, if you smush down too far, you can always reform it and push it again and push it back up. But you're going to want to attach. Now this is the point where you would take your dowel rod, or I will. If you call me over, I'll do that. And we put that pencil through. We get his eye really smoothed out because anything that's rough is going to be rough when it comes out. And then I think I'm going to do something a little fancy. I'm going to pinch off his tail and just bend it up a little bit so it looks a little fancy. You don't have to. You can cut it off straight if you want, but I like mine a little fancy. And then if you look at it from the side, that's what my snail looks like from the side. Now, he doesn't look much like a snail right now, but remember, he's going to have eyes popping out with pipe cleaners and googly eyes later on. So this is just the start. So once you're done, I'm going to give you a paper towel with a piece of tape. You're going to put your name and your class code. You don't have to put your last name unless there's 2 Gavins or 2 Daniels in the same room, or 2 Samanthas, or whatever it is. You usually know if there's somebody else in your class with your same name. So put your class code on there too. So if you are 2B or 2C or 2A, please make sure you put that on there because sometimes they do get mixed up. Sometimes it happens. So we want to make sure that we're taking care of that ahead of time, because once these dry, I'm going to scratch your name in the bottom and your class code so that when I take them all out of the kiln and they're all mixed up, I can find them again. So make sure he sits flat. You might want to even take him and tap him a little bit just to make sure he's got a flat bottom. And then you're finished. So you'll take this back to the counter to dry. And then when it's dry, I will get that. It has to dry for about a week. And we'll cook it or fire it technically in the kiln. And I will bring it back and we will talk about glazing. In the meantime, we'll have an in-between, a flip-flop project. So we'll flip to something else after we're done with this part. But once we get rolling, we're going to get these snails in the kiln. So next time you guys come in, we're going to take care of that part. You're going to have the whole class to work. And to be done in the same class, you have to get this done in the first class. There's no second chances. Clay grows mold the longer it sits. And because you guys only see me once every 4 days, we don't want it to grow mold if we can help it. It's not going to hurt you. It's not a harmful kind of a mold. But I'd just rather not have anybody have any allergies or any risk of allergies any more than we have to. So 1 day to build it. That's all you get. Once you're done, beside the sinks, in order to clean up, our sinks do not have a big trap on them, which means a container. If it sinks to the bottom of a lake, it'll sink to the bottom of our drain too. And if we're not careful and we put too much of this yucky stuff down the sink, it's going to plug our drains to a point where we have to call somebody in and spend thousands of dollars to unplug our sink. No good. So if it'll sink to the bottom of the lake, it'll plug the pipes too. It'll sink to the bottom of the pipes. So in order to keep that from happening, I'm going to have a bucket at the back of the room beside the sink, beside each one. You're going to, and the big kids hate me saying this because it gets stuck in their heads and it gets stuck forever, and then you go, oh no, what did you do? You got it in my head. Well, yeah, that's the point. You're going to rinsey, 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 and then washy, 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 which means you're going to rinse your hands and your tools and whatever else you have in the buckets. You can even pour this little clay water in the bucket. And then once everything's washed and rinsed off, then you can wash your hands in the sink. Once all of this yucky stuff is gone and there's just a little teeny layer of it, then you can wash your hands in the sink. So don't forget, rinsey, rinsey, rinsey in the bucket, and then go to the sink and washy, washy, washy. All right, guys, so the next time you come in, we're going to let you loose. I'm going to get you your clay. You're going to start right away, and we're going to get rolling with dirt.